Great. So thank you again for joining for today's big event, the Implicit Bias and Grantmaking Wednesday webinar. This is Biz Gormley. I'm our host today. I'm here at EPIP HQ in New York, and I'm joined on the line by Janae Isler, Crystal Echohawk, and Rachel Ghazal. I'm going to take a couple minutes to welcome you and give you a sense of what EPIP is, and then move into the presentation. So, Emerging Practitioners in Philanthropy, EPIP, is a national network of foundation professionals, social entrepreneurs, and other changemakers who strive for excellence in the practice of philanthropy. And we do this by providing a platform for our community to connect with others, to learn and practice leadership skills, and to inspire emerging ideas in the social sector. We have over 1,200 members across the country, 13 active chapters, and we'd love to talk to you if you have questions about membership or upcoming events, ways to get involved, or anything about what we do here at EPIP. So please feel free to reach out to me, Biz Gormley, my email right here on the screen, biz@epip.org. And I'd love to hear what your ideas and questions are and start a conversation. We have another Wednesday webinar coming up in 2 weeks that we'd love to get on your calendars. We'll be hosting Indie Philanthropy, Stories from the Field of Reimagined Funding. That's on March 30th at 3 p.m. Eastern. You can go to our website at epip.org/events to see all upcoming webinars as well as local chapter events. And we are very excited to have announced our annual conference dates and location. We're going to be hosting the annual conference this year, September 13 to 15 in Baltimore, Maryland. And we'd love to welcome you to be part of the event in whatever way makes sense for you. Right now, we're just asking you to save the date, but you can learn more about the conference and our theme at the web link provided on the screen. Some short housekeeping notes for today's webinar. You'll see the question box on your control panel, and you can use that to share any issues you may be having with technical difficulties. Also use that in the portions where you're asked to share commentary. You can use that to share your thoughts. And anytime that you have questions, you can post questions in there throughout the presentation, as well as at the times that we pause for Q&A. That's where you should please enter in your questions. You should know that the polls and questions are anonymous unless you explicitly would like them not to be. The poll section will come up later and you'll see all answers are anonymous. The questions, we can read your name if you'd like us to. If you're following us on social media, we'd love to get you involved in the conversation by using the hashtag EPIPWebinar. Our Twitter handle is EPIPNational if you'd like to tag us there, and we'd love to be in touch online. The webinar is being recorded for our archives. And at the very end, when the call ends, you'll be prompted to complete a post-webinar survey. We'd love to invite you to do so. It's only a few questions, and it allows us to get a sense of both the content and its value and how it met your expectations, as well as topics you'd like to see in the future. So please take a moment to share your thoughts there. Thanks. So without further ado, I'm honored to be able to introduce today's panel. Thank you so much to all of you for the work that you've done to bring together this topic. Perhaps, unfortunately, it is an essential thing for us to be discussing, but I'm so thrilled to see so many people taking time out of the day, and grateful to each of you for bringing your expertise to this conversation. So without further ado, welcome to Crystal, Janae, and Rachel, and I will bring up your presentation now. All right.
Great. Thanks, Biz. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, good. So we are very happy to be here, and we have also a little quick introduction, housekeeping pieces to run through before we jump in. But I want to thank Biz and EPIP for once again inviting NCRP to partner with them on a webinar. Next slide. So we wanted to share a few details about upcoming NCRP events, and I won't spend too much time here. All of our events are on our website, ncrp.org. on our events page. So feel free to take a look there at other things we have coming up that may be in your area or at conferences that you'll be attending. Next slide. And we also have social media handles here for myself. I'm Jay LaChapelle. We also have handles for Rachel and for Crystal, and then of course EPIP and NCRP. So we really encourage you to tweet now during the webinar and also afterwards to keep the conversation going. And I know that NCRP has some folks on our end who'll be there to engage on Twitter with you as well. Next. So this is what we will be covering today. I'll give a little bit more detail about the three of us, and we'll talk about the nuts and bolts of the science of implicit bias with Rachel. And then we'll talk more specifically about how it plays out in philanthropy, and then even more specifically, how it plays out against Native Americans, both within philanthropy and the larger society. And then we'll give some ideas and tools about how to address implicit bias and racism in our sector. And of course, we always love Q&A and would love to hear from you with your questions and your observations on how we might all address this issue together. Next. So here are our lovely faces once again. Again, I'm Janae Isler, the field director at NCRP. We'll also have Crystal Echohawk from Echohawk Consulting. She has written for NCRP multiple times and is a veteran in philanthropy, has led foundations and is now doing consulting with philanthropy about how they can better engage with Native American communities and just in general with their constituents. And then Rachel Ghazal, who is at the Perception Institute and is also a professor, will share some of the nuts and bolts of the science of implicit bias. So if these wonderful women would like to share other things about themselves, they can do so during their portions of the presentation. And I know that all of us would love to hear from you afterwards if you have additional questions about our specific areas of work. Next. So I think we're going to do the poll here, Biz, actually, before we jump into making meaning.
Okay, great. One sec.
While Biz is setting that up, I wanted to share, we want to do a few polls just to get a sense of who's on the line, because one of the things we'll talk about today is how addressing implicit bias may look different depending on your role within your organizations or within society at large. So to help inform our conversation for the presenters, we want to know who's here and get a stronger picture. So the first poll is open. And again, the polls are anonymous, but please tell us what kind of organization you work for. All right, so we are at about 80%, and we have about 20 seconds left for the poll. Okay, so we have over half of the folks are at foundations, and then it's pretty evenly split with the rest of the folks at nonprofits, advisory firms, and other. Our next poll, there it is, talks more about you and your specific role. Tell us what you do at your organization. Okay, so pretty much everyone has voted. Most of us here on the line are at the associate level, and then we have a few managers and directors and some CEOs, which is great. So that's really wonderful for us as presenters because we have a range of folks on the line, and we will talk about how in our different positions we have different entry points and different leverage points to address implicit bias. So with that, now that we know who's here and we know who the presenters are, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel Ghazal, who's going to talk about the science of implicit bias. Rachel, are you there? Maybe you're on mute.
Hi, this is Rachel Ghazal. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I disappeared during the polls completely inadvertently. It's an honor to be here, and thank you so much to everyone. So the science of implicit bias has to begin with understanding how our brains operate. And this seems a little counterintuitive, except that the whole idea here is our conscious brains, our conscious values, may go one way and our unconscious another. And this is a moment in time where sometimes the conversations about implicit bias seem a little out of place because we're seeing so much, frankly, explicit bias. But in a call like this, where essentially everyone involved is in the work, particularly to address issues of injustice involving every kind of identity category as well as other areas of structural inequality, we sometimes think, well, how can this involve us? Because we know that we have conscious values that are egalitarian, and we assume that sort of we're on the same page, we share the same values, and we do, except that our conscious brains don't do as much work as our unconscious. The current science suggests that our conscious brains are capable of processing about 40 bits of information during the time that it takes our unconscious to process 11 million. So what is our unconscious brain doing while it's processing that information? Well, it's making meaning, and it does that by all the colors and the shapes and the stimuli that we see are literally put into categories that our brains have adapted to organically and without our even being conscious of it. Not next slide, or next image rather. So why babies? Actually, back to the babies. That was, I said, next image. So why babies? Well, many of us have heard the adage that babies are born blind, but babies are not actually blind in the sense that they don't see stimuli. Rather, they don't have categories into which to put any of the colors or other visual information that they're receiving, and so they're functionally blind. But because of the way our brains adapt, babies begin creating associations with the people who, or the sort of the entities that provide them love and food and all the necessary affection and warmth, and that becomes sort of a category that becomes then their first word, unless, like my daughter, your first word is dog. And this is the problem with the webinars, I don't get to hear whether everyone thinks my jokes are funny. But those categories that evolve in a very adaptive way and serve enormously important purposes to allow us actually function in the world. One example in thinking about how things become unconscious is to imagine how you felt when you first learned to drive, and how impossible it seemed to be able to do all the things you had to do simultaneously in order to actually not get into some sort of horrific accident in your car. But of course, as soon as you learn to drive, as soon as it became a habit, you're able to listen to the radio, have a conversation, hopefully not text, but do all sorts of things and drive, and the driving itself is almost done by your unconscious. Next slide, please. So let's go through all the different images, because this unconscious process of creating categories occurs with objects, but it also occurs with people. Just keep on, there's a whole page full of images. And each of these images, in some sense, denotes different identity categories with which we have associations. And those associations can serve, unlike the associations with, say, again, parent, caregiver when we're talking about babies, or as an adult, knowing who a nurse is or a doctor is, so we know who can provide us, a shot in the arm or some sort of drug without, and having it be salutary and helpful rather than some sort of criminal enterprise. Other categories into which we fit have associations with them that can be not chosen positive associations from us, nor associations chosen by the identity group into which we fit, but rather associations that are from the external world, and that often for political, historical reasons have a negative set of associations with them that cause them to create obstacles to the kind of fairness and equality we would all, we're all striving for. So for example, we have a picture on the bottom of two young women engaging in science. And that's a picture that sort of consciously, I'm sure hopefully makes us smile. We're all sort of hoping to have more girls and people of color generally in the STEM fields. But I have to admit, when the word engineer pops up, I don't first think of women. Now, I have a daughter who actually wants to be an engineer, but I wasn't raised in a time where it was very common for there to be engineers. So my subconscious brain continues to, frankly, be far behind my conscious brain in how I think of certain terms. And so, next slide, please. what implicit bias refers to, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, is the brain's automatic instant association, and when I say instant, I mean literally instantaneous association of stereotypes or attitudes toward particular groups without our conscious awareness. And so the stereotypes are the traits that are associated with different groups. And we can, if we had more time, we could talk about the sort of historical, again, and political forces that resulted in those stereotypes or traits, but that's what we're referring to is sort of the qualities that we associate with particular groups. Attitudes refers to our warmth or coldness, our valence towards certain groups. And we can have negative associations and positive attitudes or the reverse. So for example, oftentimes we consider ourselves to feel warmly toward people who we would consider old or elderly, but it turns out that most of us have negative associations linked to competence when it comes to age. Or similarly, again, with respect to gender, there can be positive attitudes, but a set of associations that suggest, sort of less in terms of authority or capacity in certain areas. And then there are certain groups, and these are the groups who within our society have been most deeply stigmatized, where you have both negative associations and negative attitudes. But again, these are often unconscious rather than conscious, and they're often completely inconsistent with our conscious values that we have toward people. So how do we know we have implicit bias, or how do we know how to measure or think about implicit bias? Next slide, please. Next two images, please. Sorry about this. Why flowers and bugs? Well, the emergence of what has come to be known as the implicit association test, which was conceived by Anthony Greenwald and Masr and Banaji, two social psychologists, was Anthony Greenwald's question for himself whether he could train himself to as quickly associate positive words with bugs as he could with flowers. He was interested in sort of the speed of association and what that meant about what was in his unconscious, and apparently he's a garden person. So he created a computer task where an image of a flower would come up and a positive word, pretty, lovely, sweet, etc. And he found he could, not surprisingly, tap the computer button very quickly. Pictures of cockroaches and other particularly kind of in his view disgusting bugs would come up, and he would have words like disgusting and gross and ugly, and he could do that very quickly. His question was whether he could train himself to tap as quickly when he switched the words with the image. So when a flower came up and it said disgusting, could he tap the button as quickly? When the cockroach came up and the word pretty came up, could he touch the word as quickly? And he found no matter how many times he tried, he could not train himself to as quickly make those associations because his unconscious aversion to bugs and his unconscious preference for flowers were too powerful. Next image, please. So that process of measuring the essentially speed with which we can make positive and negative associations, or where we can make, kind of link certain traits or attributes to different groups, is what resulted in the creation of the implicit association test. So the image you have in front of you is one of the most famous of the implicit association tests, and it's linked to race and attitude. And then this particular test is a black-white implicit association test. There are IATs that are of all sorts of different groups, so it's not just white-black. It's again, it can be white and Latino or Asian American or other groups. It can also be names or religion. It can also be intragroup, so it's not necessarily always a binary, although it's often expressed that way. But what this does is it allows us to see whether we can as quickly associate positive words with one group as we can with another. And the science or the research on this has now involved millions of people worldwide, both using the implicit association test on Harvard's website, which any of us can do just by Googling it, or using the implicit association test in different laboratory studies. And virtually all of the studies have shown that implicit attitudes tend very much to track the dominant, kind of who's dominant and which groups are stigmatized in a particular country. So, in the Netherlands, for example, you have very strong and powerful sort of positive associations with people who are Dutch, and negative association, and Dutch and Christian, and negative association with those who are Dutch and Muslim. In our country, the strongest associations linked to race tend to be white and black. White Americans, by 80% or more, can more quickly link positive words to white faces than they can to black faces. And sometimes people ask, well, is this just an unconscious preference for one's own group? Well, if that were so, then you would think that every single racial or ethnic group or religious group or other identity group would have the same level of positive association with itself, and it turns out not to be the case. So African Americans, for example, approximately 40% of African Americans can as quickly associate positive words with either whites or blacks. We're talking about the black-white IAT. Approximately 40% have a pro-African American bias, and some percentage of African Americans have a pro-white bias, which is again consistent with sort of the power hierarchy within our country, and is consistent with the way that our kind of political hierarchy and our toxic culture can affect even the particular group, in the same way that sort of I have this weird issue with gender and science in light of my own upbringing, and it's inconsistent with our conscious values. Next slide, please. So what's the significance of implicit biases, and can they be relevant to those of us who consciously reject them, and can they affect the way that we do our work? Unfortunately, the answer is a resounding yes. Our implicit biases tend to be more predictive of our behavior than our conscious values because, as we talked about earlier, our unconscious brain is just so powerful. So this is a study that was done by a consulting group 2 years ago, and they sent identical memos to law firm partners. And lawyers pride themselves on objectivity. Lawyers and law firms are also, sort of consciously very interested in achieving greater diversity among associates, and yet, as you can see on your screen, the partners who received the memo that they thought was written by a third-year white associate who'd gone to NYU had a generally positive view of this associate, and notably, they found only 2.9 of the 7 intentionally embedded spelling and grammatical errors. By contrast, the lawyers who thought that the associate was written by an African-American associate who went to NYU had a generally much more negative view of the identical memo, and you'll note found twice as many of the spelling and grammatical errors, and obviously this identical memo was perceived extremely differently. Now it is sort of beyond likely that if the memo that the partners thought was written by a black associate had been perfect, they would have seen that and they would have been enthusiastic. And similarly, if the memo they thought was written by someone white was lousy, they would have seen that too. So what's important about implicit bias isn't that it prevents us from identifying sort of the exceptionals on either side. What is relevant is the rest of us, because most of us, frankly, are good but not exceptional, and this is where things like implicit bias can really affect us, particularly when we assume we can be objective. And so this has been a powerful wake-up call to lawyers and law firms that the presumption that we can know merit when we see it, we should be deeply skeptical of that. Next slide, please. Doctors. I don't think any of us think doctors wake up in the morning intending to be discriminatory, but there is a powerful set of data, both laboratory studies and field data, showing that doctors have a tendency to give different levels of care to those, frankly, who aren't white. And so there are studies involving Latinos, there are studies involving Native Americans, and there are studies involving African Americans where doctors who are shown to have bias will be able to diagnose properly across group, but they'll be likely to give different treatment recommendations linked to their bias and the set of associations and stereotypes they have toward groups. And this particular image is taken from sort of a reference to a study where residents their understanding of their assignment was to look for signs of a particular cardiac condition and to recommend treatment, and those who had high levels of anti-black bias were able to diagnose properly, but they were less likely to recommend the gold standard treatment of thrombolysis. But here's an important, a crucially important point. A small group of those who were in this particular study were given, along with all sorts of other instructions, and a very long list of instructions written in very small type, information that sometimes people use race in their diagnosis and treatment recommendation decisions. And that bit of information, which was done subtly enough so they didn't suddenly know that they were in the middle of a study involving race, was enough to make the doctors self-correct. So for that group, it didn't matter what levels of implicit bias they showed. They all were able to diagnose and treat fairly across race, and this is what's really important. Implicit biases don't have to dictate our behavior. They don't have to dictate how we respond to people, but we have to know that we have them in order to be able to correct for them. And so this is where, when we have, sort of a group of us, all of whom have strongly conscious egalitarian values, we need to be able to take stock and be aware that even good people, and in fact, all good people, because we're all human and we're all growing up in this very toxic environment, are likely to have some biases against some groups, and part of our work is to figure out what they are. Next slide, please. Implicit bias also extends beyond evaluative or cognitive information. So it sometimes is thought of in the context of things like, again, decisions about sentencing or decisions of, sort of evaluations of treatment, and that is part of what implicit bias does. But implicit bias is also relational. So we have a tendency to show our biases in the way we interact with people across identity groups, and of course, most of us are likely to receive people's body language as being more reflective of how they actually feel about us than their words. So if we're interacting with someone across group, and we are less likely to have eye contact, if we have shorter sentences, if we have our arms crossed, we stand further away, all of which have been shown to be present when someone has implicit bias against someone of another group, that person knows it, they read it. And again, we can consciously correct for this, but we have to be aware of the likelihood of our engaging in the kind of behavioral manifestations of implicit bias in order to correct. Next slide, please. So we at Perception Institute, which again I can talk about maybe if we have a little bit of time at the end, we never talk about implicit bias without also talking about racial anxiety. Alexis McGill-Johnson, who's the executive director, identified this 8 years ago when we first started as a real risk in the kind of work that we do, because the social science shows us that just like bias, the bias lens can lead to harmful outcomes, so too can racial anxiety. And this is a phenomena that is experienced by, essentially can be experienced by any of us, depending however we're situated, but it's experienced differently. So racial anxiety is the brain's stress response before or during interracial interactions, and it's experienced in our bodies with our cortisol levels going up and our cognitive functions being more depleted. And it's experienced differently if you're a person of color, because the anxiety is triggered by the concern that the person will be experiencing discrimination, hostility, stereotyping, or distant treatment, whereas whites experience it as well. We're just less likely to know that we do. And so we experience it particularly when we're worried that we're going to say or do something that will result in the person we're interacting with us to think that we're racist. So again, we're back to the general notion that our country, with some exceptions, and they're all on the internet, having very firmly held egalitarian values, and the idea of being racist is to be immoral. There was one study that showed that people considered racists to be more immoral than drunk drivers, second only to pedophiles. So the idea of being called racist or thought of as racist, and frankly particularly for liberals or progressives, is a deeply is something that we are deeply concerned about, and that seems like a good thing, except that it can have problematic outcomes. Next slide, please. Because it can show itself to look, frankly, very much like bias. So a person experiencing racial anxiety can use less eye contact, stand further away, seem more detached. Often people say really awkward or embarrassing things because your brain is so focused on not wanting to say the wrong thing that, of course, you go ahead and say the wrong thing. So examples of this, can include, sort of not being able to keep people's names straight, or sort of mentioning exactly the issue that the person would find most sensitive, and that can seem like just extremely, sort of insensitive or, again, biased behavior, but it can be a manifestation of anxiety. By contrast, if you're a person of color, managing that racial anxiety takes an enormous toll. And so when we're thinking about the environments that we're working in and the interactions that we're having across group, creating an environment in which racial anxiety is reduced along with implicit bias is crucial. And frankly, it's particularly crucial that as whites, we begin to do far more of the racial navigation work, because traditionally, we've essentially kind of been able to be normalized and think that we don't have a race and these are issues that other people deal with, even even if we're progressive, we don't think that we're the ones who are responsible. We presume this is a problem that other people have. But if we recognize that we can have implicit biases like everybody else, we can have racial anxieties, perhaps more than other people because we care about these issues, unless we've worked through them. One study that's noted at the bottom of the slide is a deeply troubling study showing that middle school teachers give students of color less critical feedback on written memos. So this is sort of the opposite of the Tom Meyer study involving law firm partners, where middle school teachers were sent intentionally badly written essays, and they were told to give the necessary feedback for the student to learn to correct and write stronger essays going forward. And what the study found was that teachers gave less critical feedback to Black and Latino students, except when the teachers were in schools where they felt like they were supported and where they felt like they belonged. And in that context, teachers were giving similar or identical feedback to Black and white students, but still giving less critical feedback to Latino students, which suggests that we have two different phenomena going on in that context. It's implicit bias against the Latino students, but it is likely to have been racial anxiety linked to the teacher's interaction with the African American students because of this concern about seeming racist. And so in thinking about what kind of fixes we need, what kind of interventions we want to create, we know that we need to tailor the interventions to the phenomena, because if you get a bunch of racially anxious people even more anxious about being biased, that's not going to lead to the kind of improvement in climate or decision making that we want to see. Next slide, please. So the work that many of us do in, again, within the racial justice, social justice world is our goal is to raise urgency around structural inequalities and to raise urgency and to gain, kind of get people activated around issues of injustice. And our tendency, and again, I will admit this was my tendency for 20 of the 25 years I've been doing this work, was to emphasize the various, sort of societal disparities that exist because, again, in my view, these disparities are caused by structural inequality, by institutional racism, by phenomena that we know to be true. And so emphasizing or highlighting these disparities, again, sort of most of us think, I certainly thought, would be necessary to trigger action to respond to them. Unfortunately, this has two outcomes that are exactly the opposite of what we intended. Emphasizing the disparities for those who aren't sort of in the, kind of in the mindset, who don't share the mindset that we have, tends to lead to a kind of a reification or a hardening of stereotypes, because people come up with stories to explain the disparities that aren't the stories that I would have. When we talk about, disparities in discipline, for example, I would immediately think, what are the decisions that the teachers are making, and why are they treating, sort of young boys of color differently? But someone who doesn't share my politics will look at disparities in discipline and think, why can't kids behave? Why can't parents respond differently? So we have to be careful when we just lift up disparity data that it doesn't trigger essentially a counter set of stereotypes among those who may not agree with us. But even within our own communities and the communities of concern with whom we're working, disparity data or deficit information can have a tendency to create a sense of everything being hopeless. Or it can, again, harden stereotypes about a group for themselves. So if we talk about, again, the lack of girls in STEM, people who have unconscious biases like I do relating to girls in STEM aren't going to go into a place of thinking, yeah, more girls in STEM. There'll be, sort of a sense of a continued highlighting of who in fact is in STEM. So it doesn't have the effect. Most people don't go where others like them aren't. Instead, that seems like a very hostile place where we shouldn't go. So there are effects of the way that we have had a tendency to talk about race. And again, I'll frankly blame my own field, civil rights lawyering, for this to some degree, because in a legal case, we have to raise the disparities. Next slide, please. So in a legal context or in a policy analyst context, of course we have to be highly aware of the data, and in fact, we have to fight against conservative efforts to prevent the collection of data so that we understand where the moral urgency is. But then we have to separate out the information that we need to identify the targets of our actions from the way that we communicate about what our intentions are and how we try and mobilize people for action, because for that we need a different frame. We need empowering frames, we need frames that emphasize agency, and it's a very different conversation than the one that we've traditionally had, and a lot of that has to do with the way that all of our brains respond to the kind of information that we produce. So I think I'm being set to the side for a minute for other conversations, but I look forward to talking with all of you again.
Next slide. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Rachel. And we're actually going to skip the discussion for the sake of time. And very briefly, can we go to the next slide? So very briefly, I wanted to point out a resource from NCRP that came out in the spring of 2015. And this resource has several articles about how implicit bias plays out in our foundations. So it's available on our website. It is the spring 2015 issue of Responsive Philanthropy, and it's available for free. So if you haven't seen it, I suggest that you take a look. And I'm going to pass it over now to Crystal, who's going to talk more specifically about some of the things she wrote for that special issue of RP around implicit bias against Native Americans. Crystal?
Thanks, Janae. Can everyone hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real honor to be here today to be able to visit with you about some of these really critical issues that we face around implicit bias in philanthropy. So to get started here, based on what Rachel and Janae have shared, and we start to understand the root causes and dynamics that can feed implicit bias, when we look at the screen and these images, these are really ripped from current headlines, from racist mascots in sports, entertainment, popular culture, fashion. That's Victoria's Secret fashion show displayed there, from business, media, and even philanthropy. When we look at the image representing quote-unquote poverty porn, images like this are widely circulated by non-native nonprofits throughout the country that are supposedly raising money to assist Native Americans, and when in fact a lot of those dollars never reach Native Americans themselves. Or even as a couple years ago, Diane Sawyer was widely criticized for her piece on expose on the Pine Ridge Reservation, Indian Reservation, and what really came across as poverty porn as well. But these images really start to feed the subconscious and how we start to think about Native Americans. Next slide. So as we think about the images I just showed, and these are some of the top stereotypes, both negative and kind of, you imagine me using air quotes around positive, that are really pervasive in society. And that Native Americans are alcoholics, that they have a tendency to mismanage projects and resources that they have. All tribes are rich now due to the casinos. All natives receive free benefits from the government and they don't pay taxes. Something we're hearing a lot lately is natives are oversensitive about their portrayal as sports mascots, and these teams and fans are only just trying to honor them. Natives are beyond help. They just have too many issues. There's also the pervasive stereotypes around just kind of the mystical, magical, noble savage. And one of the bigger ones too is that natives are just one big group with the same characteristics, views, and kind of monolithic culture. What's also not listed here, but could be categorized as stereotypes, is that natives are often just perceived as relics of the past, and that we're no longer here and that we're invisible. Next slide, please. So as we begin to think about this and really start to look at how does this all connect with philanthropy and its relationship to Native Americans, and does implicit bias exist with regard to natives? So let's just take a quick look at the data. And despite the fact that Native Americans consistently score the lowest on almost every social indicator in the country, foundation giving focused on Native Americans was only 0.3% in 2009, totaling $68 million. According to more recent data from the Foundation Center, that giving has now increased as of 2012 to $89 million, to Native Americans, and for Indigenous peoples largely outside of this country, it's increased to 90 million. Those are moderate gains, and I want to, commend progress, but still that means that it represents less than 1% of the total of foundation giving. Also noted in that data is that none of the top 50 grant recipients for ethnic and racial minorities in 2012 included a Native American-led organization or an organization that served the majority of Native Americans. And also, there's less than 25 known Native Americans in, mid to upper levels of management and executive leadership within foundations across the country. Next slide. So over the last 8 years, I've served both as a former executive director of a national Native nonprofit, the Nota Begay III Foundation, and also in my current role leading EchoHawk Consulting. I've had the opportunity to have candid conversations with a number of foundation program officers and leaders over the years about why giving is so low to Native Americans and what are really the barriers to foundations increasing their giving to Native American projects. And this slide actually reflects real conversations and insights that were shared with me over the years. Some of the highlights and something that is frequently repeated is that the Native population is too small. One of the biggest things that we hear a lot about is that grants that have been made previously to tribes or Native American projects just haven't gone well at all. Other funders, and more recently, especially following the White House convening last year regarding Native American youth, a number of funders walked away feeling like the issues just seemed too big and too complex to make a difference, and that especially when they looked at their own limited grants portfolio, they just didn't see that there was anything that they could do, and it was better just not to do anything. Other comments I've heard is that, we don't have a specific Native American grant portfolio. We only fund other issues like health, education, economic development, other things. Also have heard we're already funding one or full Native groups, so, that's enough. And we hear very consistently across the board, why aren't the tribes that have casinos funding these issues and these projects in Indian country? Next slide. So in my exploration around the existence of implicit bias in philanthropy towards Native Americans, last year I interviewed a number of my Native and non-Native colleagues in philanthropy who were quite candid in sharing their opinions about the implicit bias. Among those I interviewed was Mike Roberts, who's the president of First Nations Development Institute. They're a 35-year-old Native organization and the largest grant maker in Indian country. And Mike felt really strongly that implicit bias exists and that the Native and the narrative around Native Americans and the perceptions are that Natives are relics and we're often just romanticized when it comes to how foundation program officers view Native Americans. I also interviewed Rick Williams, who served for 20 years as the president for the American Indian College Fund, and he just recently retired. The College Fund is the largest Native nonprofit in the country. Rick shared a lot of really powerful insights as I visited with him, but as one of the things I pulled out here is that he felt like the impact of the competing narratives of one, wealthy Indians no longer need help because of the casinos, and two, that the myth that we just no longer exist are devastating and really shape the kinds of decisions that are being made in philanthropy around Native Americans. And he felt that this for sure created an implicit bias, and even when it was unintended or disguised. Next slide. So when kind of taking into account, reflecting on the statements, that have been made by program officers or other leaders in philanthropy over the years, when we think about the data, taking this all into account, it seems many, and I'm not saying all by any means, but there's many who seem to have a tendency to operate from a negative or deficit position when they're looking at Native Americans. It's kind of when you start that conversation, it seems it's oftentimes led with all of the reasons why they can't, as opposed to really thinking about all of the possibilities of what they can do. And that's also, it's important to acknowledge that some of the reasons for giving are not real, as they can be with other communities as well, especially when it comes to capacity issues that a lot of different Native nonprofits, tribes, and communities face that can really cause issues when they're trying to successfully implement a project. I think in looking at the two statements here from Mike Robertson with Rick Williams, I think the takeaway is that, you know, they're really wanting to urge funders to not automatically jump to a conclusion that it's the Indians that failed, right? But instead to rather look at when looking at work with Native communities and projects, that maybe there's a different way to create success, and success that is something that really works and is meaningful for that particular community, but that also can be defined as success for the foundation itself and its, you know, its mission values. I think in the next statement, Mike Roberts certainly is being very tongue-in-cheek here in his statement, but I think it's just his way of encouraging grant makers to hold, you know, Native organizations, tribes, and communities to the same standards that applies to other grantees. And I think if you go out in the field and you talk to a lot of CEOs and staff and tribal leaders who have operated in this world and really are, you know, out there being grant seekers, I think that they've often felt that, you know, when one Native project messes up, that means that it decreases the chances for all to get funded, and that we're just kind of held to a different standard sometimes than other communities. Next slide. So I think this is important too, moving beyond stereotypes and misinformation about Native Americans that can feed implicit bias. The invisibility through the lack of data and the inclusion of Native peoples in data sets being used to inform grant makers' strategies and giving can create its own implicit bias. And I think this is a really powerful insight that just a good friend and colleague, Jasmine Hall Ratliff, who's a program officer at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, shared. And that really showing that when we're not asking who's missing in those data sets, and I cannot tell you over my career, and I'm sure many of you have sat in those rooms as we're looking at data to really think about how we're going to develop strategies to address certain issues, that those data sets are almost always white, Black, and Latino. And so we really need to understand that through that invisibility that it's creating its own form of implicit bias. Next slide.
So, Crystal, I'm going to jump in here, recognizing that we only have about 10 minutes left in the webinar. And so, as opposed to our plan of each of us sharing specific tools, I'm going to open it up for questions while you're talking. So you can go ahead and go through this slide. But if the participants have questions, go ahead and put those now in the questions box. And when Crystal is finished with this slide, I will start to read them, and Rachel and I will weave in our examples during the Q&A. Does that make sense, Crystal?
Yeah, absolutely, and I'll be really quick. I mean, and through all of this, I do want to just call out, and you can see the names of the foundations there. There are a number of foundations that are really working to do it right, I think trying to be intentional and making positive steps. I think the biggest call to action is that we need to understand that philanthropy is increasingly data-driven. And the data that we are looking at, it needs to move beyond the lens of just white, African American, and Latino. It needs to be inclusive of Native Americans and all diverse communities. And that when we talk about equity and diversity, we must really be inclusive about that. And the way that it's being discussed in the narrative right now feels very narrowly defined. And I would just really encourage, you know, folks in philanthropy to reach out and build partnerships with tribes that are doing philanthropic giving on similar issues in their geography, like the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community, which is one of the biggest grant makers in Indian country. And there's just a plethora and a wealth of Native organizations out there that can really serve as expert guides in helping to navigate and do more work in Indian country. So thank you.
Thanks, Crystal. So we haven't had, oh, here we are. We have question coming in, and it says, how do you mitigate racial anxiety? And I'm going to assume that's addressed to Rachel, since that's something that she mentioned. So Rachel, can you share a little bit more about how to mitigate racial anxiety?
Sure. So it can be mitigated depending upon where we sit in different ways, but the main goal is to be outward focused and not inward focused. So I think that there's always the risk when we are, again, dealing with an issue like bias of thinking, how am I being perceived? If the anxiety is from someone white, am I being perceived the right way? What am I doing? But that's, again, that's kind of about us. And so if we're talking about managing racial anxiety from the perspective of someone white, the emphasis has to be, how is what I'm saying landing, and am I engaging in a way that's sort of real and authentic? If it's an issue of where the racial anxiety comes into play in a sort of consistent way, so you have job interviews, or again, if you're dealing with grantees, frankly, this sounds a little bit hokey, but having a script and knowing the certain questions and the certain sort of topics that you engage with everybody can give you some certainty about what you're going to say, so then you can focus on how you're saying it and making sure that you're really engaging with the person. There's a whole set of strategies that have been developed, but again, by some really amazing social psychologists of color, to talk about managing and addressing racial anxiety as experienced by people of color from different perspectives. And I'm happy to share that as well. It's a more complicated set of information, so I don't want to talk too much and keep the question line open. So please let me know if that's the perspective from which you'd like the question to be answered.
Thanks, Rachel. So we have another question that says, the federal government is one of the biggest grant makers. How do we reach out to government to fold public sector into conversations about implicit bias in grant making? And actually, Crystal, I'll pull you in on that if you have experience with working with the government on this issue, which I believe that you do.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's just something that we've been really fortunate with this administration, that I think President Obama and his administration has been very open to really having those very candid and frank conversations. And we've seen kind of the historic moves in looking at the way that they have adjusted the way that they are doing federal funding and doing some very large and signature initiatives to address very specifically Native American issues. And so, unprecedented and historic levels of new funding have come under this administration. So, but that's come through a lot of hard work on a number of different fronts, both by tribal leaders to nonprofits, but foundations play a very important role in that. And I think it's really looking at bringing the diversity of voices together, cutting across different communities and constituencies and sectors, is how we're going to be able to raise this level of conversation with the federal government, and so that it can get the attention that it needs.
Thanks, Crystal. So we have a question here that says, what are key practices to cue program officers to the possibility of implicit bias in order to lead to self-correcting, as discussed in the heart attack example? And how do we institutionalize such practices? So I'll kick that to either one of you. Rachel, why don't you answer first if you have some thoughts?
So if the goal is to, I think, again, intentionality, Crystal emphasized intentionality, and that's precisely the remedy in some sense with implicit bias across a whole line of issues, and being cognizant of the gaps. And again, the examples involving, sort of the invisibility of Native Americans is a very powerful example of, literally sort of a gap in many people's brains about the communities who should be sort of, part of the communities of concern for all foundations. And so I think she's given us a perfect example of how to begin to change practices, and it starts with essentially an audit. So you start to really be to examine, sort of who's being funded, where are the groups and places and sort of areas that aren't being funded, and at what place do the disparities begin to emerge. So it can be very data-driven in a sense, but as Crystal emphasized, the identification of what data counts has to itself be examined. So I think the being intentional, being mindful is the beginning point, but then thinking of systems and practices that may, kind of create pipelines where some groups are, sort of being sped through and other groups are being kind of impeded at different points is really critical. But I'd love to turn the table to Crystal to talk more specifically too.
Great. Biz, could you advance to Crystal's third tool slide? It's a little bit down the presentation.
So
One more. Next. The one before it. Go ahead, Crystal.
Sorry. Yeah, that's not mine. But but just I think some tools for program officers. I mean, one of the biggest things I think that Rachel said was the first place is acknowledgement. And I think it's finding those ways to have those very either self-reflective moments or those very candid and safe conversations internally amongst yourselves and program officers, leadership, staff, et cetera. First is that acknowledgement, and then really looking at how do you get education training, how do you engage, how do you kind of really further the understanding of the roots of that implicit bias that might exist. I think also that's really getting out beyond that and really looking at how you're going to address it and setting some real meaningful goals around what does that mean in terms of the diversity of internally within your foundation or your institutional staff. To goals to increase grant making or relationship building with different diverse communities. And I think it's absolutely essential to define some real metrics for how you are going to start to address that and start to make a real change, because that is going to be, that's how we're really going to define success. And I really strongly encourage people to also really go to the source, go to these diverse communities and really listen and empower these voices, because they can be great partners and also could be great partners in designing these strategies. Oftentimes the most well-intentioned strategies can be really detrimental to different types of communities.
So we have a few other questions that came in. One is whether or not folks can get the slide deck, and I'll make sure that we work with EPIP to provide that for you. And Biz can talk about whether the recording will be shared with attendees. Biz, can you advance to the resources slide? It's third from the end. We had a question about specific organizations, this one, who could potentially help foundations address implicit bias, and so we've listed quite a few of them here on this slide. Rachel's organization is one of them, Crystal's company is another, but we've listed quite a few here on this slide, so you can reference that if you want additional resources. And then finally, I want to acknowledge there was a question about asking Rachel to elaborate on how not to create deficit-focused stereotypes. So I encourage you, you have all of our contact information. That might be something that Rachel can reply to privately. So I know that we were rushed there at the end, but a lot of the specific resources are well written on the slides, and all three of us are very happy to follow up with you on specific questions. So please do use our contact information to get in touch. And with that, I will kick it back over to Biz.
Thank you so much, Janae. Really, Crystal, Rachel, everyone, this has been phenomenal. And also everyone who's on the call, your great questions and for participating in the polls. Yes, absolutely. The slides and the recording are going to be on the website. They'll be there by the end of the day on Friday, if not before. So just take a peek under our program section in the Wednesday webinar portion. There's an archive there. So you absolutely have access to the slides, even some of the ones we weren't able to get to, and contact information, etc. Will be there. So thank you again so much, all of you. I look forward to continued conversation and hope everyone has a great day. Take care.
Bye.